Ukrainian friends, who of course are full members of the European family, and we want to say to them that we will stand by them and mobilize very quickly in order to strengthen the links that we have with the population of Ukraine. And we will also be there to support their choices on their path, which is a European path. We have also had the opportunity to discuss the way in which Europe can embark upon the agenda of sovereignty. Let me quickly run through the three pillars that we have today set out in the declaration. We are looking to the future in this way to give an impetus to the European project, to make it a committed and robust one. First of all, we have the question of energy. This is not new today, this challenge of energy. We decided to embark upon climate neutrality by 2050, and the idea is to move towards greater independence while facing the humanitarian challenges. And there are a number of points that we want, obviously, to deal with. First of all, is the question of prices and the impact for families throughout Europe, and also for businesses. The question of dependence, which is too great. That's what we're seeing today, particularly our dependence on Russia. And we're pursuing that ambition. We want to release ourselves from that dependency so that we can act as best we can in line with our own interests, in line with our objectives. And obviously, for the next winter, we need a particular plan. Now, all of this is agreed on by the Council, together with the Commission, which is going to be following up on our work here. And this is a very consistent agenda that has been initiated. Secondly, the question of defence and security. Defence Europe. We've been talking about this for a long time. Some progress has already been made, but there's no denying the fact that 2 weeks ago we woke up in a different Europe, in a different world. We can't deny the fact that the actions taken over the last few days, in fact, consecrate the emergence of a European defence. It has formally been initiated through the meeting today in Versailles. And we have now an operational strategy in which we will identify the actions and investments that are going to be necessary. We've also identified how it's going to be possible to roll out a European industrial base, taking on board the different challenges, that of cybersecurity, that of space, for instance, just to cite two examples. So there too, there's a timeline, an agenda that's been set. That is a mission for the Commission, and progress will be made further. Third point that I'd like to mention, the importance of consolidating our economic base. Europe is there to work in the interests of peace, security and prosperity. There's an economic pillar, in other words. So it's up to us, it's up to our generation to take decisions today that are going to make that economic base far more robust, far more resilient. And here I can refer to what we've done in the area of health. We've seen with COVID how important it is to coordinate even further. There's also the ambition linked to the semiconductors, chips, raw materials, critical materials, and, of course, the vital need to continue to be committed to innovation, particularly technological innovation. So just in a few words, that's what I can say about these very significant decisions that have been taken today. And there's a real awareness shared by all of the leaders of Europe here in Versailles. We're all aware of the importance of the moment that we're living through and the decisions that we're taking, not just for tomorrow and the next few months, but for coming generations. We must move towards peace, prosperity and security. These are the challenges we must pick up so that we can see tangible results more independence, more sovereignty, less fragility, and a greater ability to determine our own fate for the European Union. We'll have the opportunity to come back to the implementation of all of these measures, because there's going to be European Council in Brussels in 2 weeks' time. We'll be taking a look at energy and other issues. We also intend, before the June summit, to have an extraordinary summit, which means that we'll be able to take a look again at security and defence. So once again, I'd like to thank President Macron for having brought us here today in Versailles at such a symbolic place, symbolic moment. It's at the heart of European history. And yesterday and today, we came together to carry through this ambition for Europe. Thank you.
Merci Charles, merci Emmanuel, merci de nous recevoir.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you for hosting us in such a historic site. We're talking about the future of Ukraine and the future of the European Union and our democracies. And it is that history that is being written as I speak. Our destinies are linked. Ukraine is a member of the European family. Putin's aggression against Ukraine is an aggression, an attack against all the principles that we hold dear. It's an attack against democracy, against sovereignty of states, against the freedoms of a people to choose its own destiny and shape its own future. The way in which we respond today to this odious attack by Russia against Ukraine will determine the future of Ukraine and also the future of our Union, and going beyond that, even the future of the entire European continent. So let us remain faithful to the principles that have been our guiding principles in our common responses to date. It's responsibility, unity, solidarity and determination.
This crisis has indeed made us face up to our responsibilities in the face of a new reality. First, our duty to continue ensuring reliable, secure and affordable supply of energy to European consumers. In the midterm, this means getting rid of our dependency on Russian gas by diversification of supply, by massively investing in renewables. Renewables are homegrown, they create jobs here in Europe. They are a strategic investment in our security and in our independence. And this is why the European Commission outlined Repower EU this week.
The European Commission President, they're speaking from Versailles, Ursula von der Leyen. We're just going to break out from that press conference because Chancellor Olaf Scholz is speaking at the moment as well, and we want to take you there live to listen to what he's saying.
That we have been discussing today.
We also discussed topics that we had addressed yesterday, but I think this was a very important summit at a special place, but first and foremost a summit in a very special moment in time. It was clear that we have the strong will to stand together, to stand shoulder by shoulder in managing this crisis and in shaping and winning the future together. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a number of questions. Michael Fischer will start. Chancellor, the former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder is currently in Moscow to talk to President Putin about the war in Ukraine. Will you talk to him when he returns? Will you want to talk to him? Are you supporting this initiative? Well, at this point in time, I cannot comment. We will certainly be able to take note of the results and include that in everything we have engaged in, undertaken. The French President and I have done many things. We have had intensive discussions with President Putin as well, and we always talk to Ukraine again and move forward with the discussions that are necessary in order to reach a ceasefire. and make the possibility for peace talks leading to concrete results. And there is one very clear principle for us: we will not take decisions on behalf of Ukrainians. They need to know what's best for their country in this dangerous situation. And this is why we have very close contacts with Ukraine as well.
Als nächstes Anne Gellinek vom ZDF.
Anne Gellinek, ZDF.
Herr Bundeskanzler, Anne Gellinek, ZDF in Brüssel.
Federal Chancellor at ZDF Brussels. You said that the heads of state or government were united and agreed on many things at this summit, but we had the impression that Germany was stepping on the brakes somehow when it comes to oil and gas imports from Russia, and also whether there can be a quicker accession of Ukraine to the EU. What was the pressure on you in these discussions, especially when it comes to the ban on energy imports from Russia? Well, we have had large agreement, and the position I have taken and many other heads of state or government have taken for a long time has become the EU's common stance as well. We know that this is a different situation. We know that our situation is different from the US or Canada situation, who depend much less on energy imports because they are a net exporter of energy, so they have more possibilities to deal with this situation. And this is something that both the Canadian Prime Minister and the American President are very well aware of. I had discussions with them, and they told me that what they do is something, and they know that Europe cannot do to the same degree. And this is also part of the consensus that we have agreed on together. We will continue to push forward with sanctions that have direct impacts on economic prospects for Russia. Part of this is financial sanctions that have been massive so far and show more and more consequences by the day. If you see at Russian economic prospects and the financial industry there. And at the same time, we have combined this with export and import restrictions when it comes to high-tech products that will no longer be exported to Russia. This has dramatic consequences in Russia as well. And this is a deliberate, well-founded decision that from our side, we cannot cut the imports that we are having in Europe today, but what we will do as soon as possible is coming out of this dependence. And by the way, the discussion about the question of membership has been a very constructive discussion. One thing has been clear to everybody. The immediate task for us is a swift accession perspective for the Western Balkan states. This is a task that has been on the agenda for a long time and needs to be solved shortly. There has been a lot of preparatory work, and there is a lot of democratic passion in these countries, and this perspective is necessary for them. So this will need to be speeded up, and the same is true for the necessity to be aware of the fact that we need institutional reforms in Europe. In order to be able to take up new members, we will need more majority voting. It needs to be clear that rule of law criteria apply, that there is no doubt in terms of accession that they will always be applied, and that the existence of the rule of law and rule of law structures and infrastructure needs to be reliable before and after accession. They need to meet Europe's quality standards. And in this context, we have very clearly stated again what has already been agreed upon before. We are glad about the Ukrainian population and government, their efforts towards Europe and the path they have decided on. Andreas Rinke, Reuters. Mr. Chancellor, the High Representative suggested that 500 billion euros more should be made available for military support for Ukraine. Do you share this opinion, and has this been adopted today? Another question on Iran, where the nuclear talks have been suspended. Are you concerned that Russia will use its negative influence on the Iran nuclear talks as well? Well, first of all, the European Union has been very active in many initiatives and has made a contribution.
Let's take you now back to Versailles. Not U.S. President, French President, rather. Emmanuel Macron is now speaking. Let's take a listen to what he has to say.
Against Ukraine and its population is a tragic turning point for our history. We're all aware of the fact that it's a turning point as well for our societies, for our peoples, and for our European project. For the last 2 weeks, our response, ladies and gentlemen, this has just been said, we've responded through unity, rapidity, and a spirit of responsibility. Choices were made very quickly, all 27, with our institutions, and coordinated with all of our partners in the context of NATO and G7. Diplomatic work has made it possible to isolate Russia, inter alia, recently at the General Assembly of the United Nations. For 2 weeks now, Ukrainian men and women have been fighting courageously to defend their freedom, their democracy, their sovereignty and the integrity of their land. Europeans have a clear position, unanimous and firm condemnation of the Russian aggression at all international levels, and we've drawn full consequences of this, inter alia with the resolution that was adopted at the General Assembly. Support to Ukraine. Together, we've agreed to deliver hardware, not just humanitarian material, but also weapons. And we've proposed today that the European facility be added to the tune of some 500 million, which is going to allow us to go further in this line. Countries that in the past were traditionally neutral, Sweden, for instance, have decided for the very first time that for the first time in decades they would take an active role in the support to Ukraine. We also have economic support, humanitarian support. This will be continued. Some 2 million refugees have been welcomed. Madam von der Leyen has referred to this, and I'd like to thank the populations of the neighbouring countries, Poland, Hungary, Romania and Moldova as well. And obviously France will be playing its role, and I would hope that we will be able to have the necessary mechanisms of solidarity that can be used in this overall approach. As of the very outset, we also deployed massive, unheard-of sanctions, and this was done very quickly. Second, fourth, 6 days of conflict, they were marked by European decisions of these unprecedented sanctions. We're willing to adopt other sanctions, and all options are on the table. The point of our discussion is to prepare ourselves for these sanctions if they were able to call a halt to the attack and the aggression, and could prepare us also for the consequences in the coming weeks and months. Our initial objective is, of course, a rapid return to peace, starting with a ceasefire, followed by a rapid withdrawal of Russian troops. And that is why keeping up pressure on Russia, and we're also maintaining a very demanding dialogue, in particular in conjunction with the German Chancellor. So the support to solidarity for Ukraine is what kept us very busy, particularly yesterday. We support Ukraine today, and we will do that for as long as the war lasts. And we will be there for the reconstruction of this destruction brought about by Russia. We will be there to help it to stand up and stay standing. The message that we've sent out to the Ukrainian population is that the path to our Europe is open to them. Their fight for freedom and democracy, for the values that we all share, has demonstrated that Ukraine is indeed a member of our European family. We also want the applications made by Moldova and Georgia as well be examined in line with our treaty by the European Commission, so that the acceptability can be determined in line with the provisions of our treaty. The Versailles Declaration, the agenda of Versailles that we've been discussing today, is linked to the fact that sovereignty in Europe, which might have been thought of by some as a slogan or a sort of French fantasy, is seen by all today as being crucial. This sovereignty, this strategy of independence has been there at the very start, also of the pandemic. We've seen what had to be done. It's there when we had to produce and deliver vaccines for ourselves and for other countries. We've seen it when we came out of the crisis, the start of the recovery, when we saw what was happening as regards the semiconductors, when we had delegated production to the other parts of the world, how difficult it was to return to the manufacturing of cars, for instance. And we're seeing it in the context of this crisis, where we can see how our food, our energy, our defense are all issues of sovereignty. We can cooperate. We want to be open to the world, but we want to choose our partners and not depend on any. That's what we mean by sovereignty. It's not protectionism. It's not a question of closing the door. It's a question of having the possibility of staying open without being dependent. So the Versailles agenda has set out the next few months' work along those lines. As regards defense, we want to be able to define the investments that we need. Several of us are already at the level of 2% of GDP invested in defense. Others have further efforts to make, but we're going to make coordinated efforts. We're going to identify our needs in budgetary terms. We're going to identify capabilities that are required. We'll also identify our needs when it comes to possible new conflicts, whether we're talking about shipping, maritime space, and also identify what we need in order to develop the European industrial tissue. If we're going to import more in the way of hardware from elsewhere, then there's not much point pursuing this sort of sovereignty. We need to think in terms of partnerships, yes, but we have to be able to decide to consolidate and to construct a defense industry with fewer standards but corresponding to an integrated market. So there are a number of decisions that we've already taken.
Pour atteindre dès l'année dernière ces 2% d'investissement et pour relancer beaucoup de ces filières et de ces capacités. L'Allemagne a décidé il y a un peu plus de 10 jours.
About 10 days ago, Germany decided to make historic investments for the country, and Denmark made an historic choice, deciding to ask the people if they want to come back to the European security and defense project. You can see that everywhere around the European continent, historic choices are being made, and this is a major turning point. We need to have the organization so that we can build this joint ambition in defense. And this is what we have asked the Commission to do, so that by May, when we will no doubt have an extraordinary meeting of the Council before the summit in June, the summit meeting in June, we will work up a plan which is full for investment to get our industries up to the right capacity and capability level. And then we've got the question of climate strategy. We've started building our own independence. Getting out of fossil energy is a matter of becoming independent. And we know that moving away from coal was a special point. Then we moved to gas, but that's gas that we have imported and are still importing from Russia. The situation that we're in at the moment, and which we will have tomorrow, means we have to reassess this strategy and be even more ambitious with our climate plans. And for that, we will have a check on this by late March and see how we can provide the support for our populations for price. And we're going to work on this at the Commission with concrete objectives for prices and for refilling, so that we can guarantee there are mechanisms, which means that we're not subjected to the contingencies of the market or speculation of the market in particular in crisis situations. Many of you have already taken steps to protect our citizens and companies, and we need to have European choices. And in the 2 weeks to come, we will do our best so that we can stand up to the price shock which comes from the geopolitical context. Prices were going up before the war, and they're continuing to increase because of the war. Then, of course, we have the sanctions which are coming in, and we must prepare ourselves so that we are not so sensitive to the dependency on Russia. And this is what we've scheduled for May for the Commission. As the two presidents pointed out, we have the plan to step out of the dependency on fossil fuels from Russia so that we can get out by 2027, so that we are no longer dependent on Russian gas, oil and coal. That's by 2027. This means there has to be new investment, new facilities, so that we can support our choices for renewables and for nuclear energy. You can see that March and May will be very busy for energy subjects. And there are other issues that we will have to work together on to ensure that we are independent and sovereign. There's the food strategy. And whether we're talking about wheat or maize or grain crops in general, we know that Ukraine and Russia are two huge markets, and Europe is already being upset by the war on the food supply market, and this will be even more so in 12 to 18 months with the impact on Ukraine and crops there. And there will be a major disturbance to food supplies in feed supplies. So we have to strike a new balance and look at food production so that we can have autonomy for our food production and for protein production. And we must reassess the strategy for Africa, because a number of African countries are going to be hit by famines in the next 12 to 18 months because of this war. Then there's sovereignty for other commodities, raw materials, for rare materials. And I've mentioned the question of semiconductors, there's healthcare. I won't go through the whole list, but we have this agenda. We will be going through this in the months to come with very concrete proposals for investments which will make it possible to have more sovereign and more independent Europe. We will be encouraging private investments. This is the idea with the tax on energy. And we're going to have the union of capitals, and we're going to look at the single market in different sectors. And we have to have the appropriate monetary possible. Yep. We're not going back to normal now, it's quite clear, and the Central European Bank will be following its work, and will be doing this very clearly in the current geopolitical context. And we'll have national investment policies.
You've been watching live footage of the press conference by French President Emmanuel Macron, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and European Council President Charles Michel. That's taking place right now in Versailles, where a meeting of EU leaders has just concluded. We also heard a little earlier from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and they all used two words repeatedly: sovereignty and independence. Let's find out more about what just happened in Versailles. DW correspondent Bava Wezel is standing outside in the rain. Thank you so much. Strategic autonomy, energy security, becoming self-sufficient. Is that the EU's new top priority?
That is the EU's priority after the summit, because to sum it up, really, Lila, this summit hasn't been so much about helping Ukraine. This summit has been about shoring up the EU's own position. And the French President, Emmanuel Macron, of course, we heard his rather lengthy discourse about all the problems that have been thrown up by the EU's politics throughout the last 5 years. He was the one, very early on, when he came into office, who said Europe needs to be more independent, needs to be more autonomous, shouldn't rely so much on others, particularly on Russia, of course, and should sort of deploy their own strengths more. And he could now, and he can now sort of stand up and say, I told you so. He just avoided that. But, of course, it means for Europe that they will have to completely orientate their politics, that they will have to sort of reorientate their industrial policy, manufacture many things that they have had from other parts of the world before, because the point is not to be politically blackmailed anymore in the future. And that is the hard thing that they are facing now. They are, in a way, being blackmailed by Russia, which is waging this atrocious war in Ukraine, because they're still taking energy deliveries from Russia, oil and gas, and they're not quite ready yet to turn them off. And it sort of gives them moral problems, and they do have moral scruples, but they don't see a way out. We heard the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, reiterate that. And so they say, we don't want this to happen again in the future. But if you sum it up in the end, Lila, it means that for Ukraine, they're on their own at the moment, and the European Union is sort of looking to sort of figure out how to weather the crisis from their side.
So Ukraine, for the moment, on their own, in your assessment, the war in Ukraine is, of course, existential for Ukraine, first and foremost. We've seen, of course, images in these past 2 weeks of millions of people displaced, hospitals now being bombed, Russian forces targeting soft civilian targets. Will EU leaders be able to face off potentially increasing public pressure on to do more?
That is the big question, because at the moment they're not willing to. But there is some here. We've heard some European leaders, for instance, the Finnish Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, who said when she came into this summit meeting in the morning, who said, we are feeding Putin's war chest. We are filling it because we are still importing energy from him. And everyone here knows that. So if public pressure increases, if European leaders do get the impression that they will sort of have to follow public will, that the public is willing to bear the consequences, which will be really hard with energy prices going through the roof and industry in Europe getting into trouble, particularly in Germany, then they might move on that. At the moment, they're not ready to do this. But Emmanuel Macron, the French president, also said everything is still on the table. So that might have been a hint in that direction. Further discussion is to be had. And of course, when I said Ukraine is on its own, it doesn't mean that they will not do everything to help. They will give money, humanitarian aid. They are welcoming refugees from Ukraine, and the numbers are increasing daily. They are trying to put in logistics into Ukraine, trains, for instance, from the German train operator Deutsche Bahn, to bring goods into Ukraine as long as that is still possible. More military aid is also talked about. Another 500 million are proposed to flow into that. So yes, they're doing everything except for sort of really damaging their own position. And that means sort of the final boycott, and that's the final turn of the screw with regard to sanctions, the final boycott for oil and gas.
DW correspondent Barbara Wezel reporting from the summit in Versailles. Barbara, thank you very much. You're watching DW News, a recap now of the main story from the crisis. The central Ukrainian city of Dnipro becomes a target of Russian air assaults for the first time. Emergency services say an apartment block and kindergarten were hit. Russian troops are also edging ever closer to the capital, Kyiv, while hundreds of thousands remain trapped in the port city of Mariupol amid heavy bombardment. I'm Leila Harak in Berlin. On behalf of all of us here at DW News, thank you for making us part of your day. We'll be back in a bit.
Every day counts for us and for our planet.